Hello friends, this is Growl. This is going to be my official Resto Shaman Mythic Plus 9.0.5 guide. This is going to be half and half. Part of it is going to be my thoughts and changes on Resto Shaman as a whole since the launch of my original guide at the beginning of the expansion, and the other half is going to be Resto Shaman and high keys and how you should change your play and maybe equip yourself to handle better when you're pushing harder content. I still believe that most or all of the stuff in my original Resto Shaman guide is relevant, so if you're just leveling up your guide looking for something that's going to help you start out, I would recommend going to that first. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as well as a bunch of timestamps to different parts of the video if you just have a question about one or two specific things. So with that, I want to go into a little bit more of an intro. I just wanted to say thanks for everyone who's been watching my content and supporting me over the last couple months. I was working really hard to come out with videos, and I've honestly been just amazed at the feedback and how much people have enjoyed my stuff, and I've tried to improve the quality more and more. And lately I've been really let's say preoccupied with real life stuff, and I've sort of been on the fence where I try and create stuff and then I feel like it's not good and I don't release it. And you've probably noticed that my rate of content that I've been uploading has been going down a little bit lately, and I want to try and fix that a little bit and start putting out some more stuff. Unfortunately, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm not going to do a lot of editing. I just want to do some talking and share my thoughts because I think a lot of people will be helped by this, and this is also a lot of stuff I want to share. I also want to do a video on Disc Priest, and I might also do a video on some of the other healers I'm playing in high keys, including Holy Priest, which might surprise you guys. So either way, I just wanted to say thanks, and I hope that no one gets the impression that I'm getting burned out or I'm not enjoying YouTube or whatever. I've just been busy and doing stuff lately, and also second guessing a lot of the stuff that I make. So thank you to everyone who's watching this video, especially if you haven't skipped through already to the part of the video that you cared about and you're just watching for me. So without further ado, let's talk about some stuff. So the first thing I want to talk about is the damage meta that we're starting to see develop in high keys. This is something that I don't think was really prevalent until towards the end of BFA, and we're seeing it go quicker and quicker, and we're already seeing it in some of the top teams in Shadowlands. And damage matters so much in the highest keys. And so a lot of the decisions that you'll hear me talking about or that you'll see from myself or other healers is talking about damage, just because every second counts. When you're competing with some of the best in the world and you're trying to push out as much damage and time as possible, you're going to see decisions about damage matter. So I want you to understand that context about some of the decisions I make, that it might not necessarily be the best for healing, but what I want to do is explain my thought process for what I run and give you the tools necessary to equip yourself to at least make those decisions and decide. Damage, it can be fun as a healer, but ultimately your job as a healer is to heal. And if you're working up the ladder trying to find a group, chances are you're probably going to find a group by being a good healer and staying alive and keeping your team alive, not by doing damage. But understand that once you break into a certain level, every point of damage matters. So with that being said, let's talk about stat priority. You'll see my stats right now. This is my set of gear that I use the most. I have fairly high haste, fairly high verse, and then basically no crit or mastery. The reason for that is damage. I'm trying to do the most amount of damage possible, and with Shaman, haste followed closely by verse, or with some mix of both, is going to be your best stats for damage. Crit and mastery, however, are great for healing. So if you're just trying to optimize for a more all-around like mixed style, you honestly want a little bit of every stat. You don't want to have stats very low at all. You need a little chunk of haste because your casts are going to be really, really slow if you have low haste, under 10%. I'm sure a lot of you guys felt that when you were leveling your Shaman. I think mastery, also having a good chunk of mastery feels really good, because when your team is in danger and they need big healing, the mastery really kicks in and becomes something that helps way more than any other stat. Even though it doesn't help your healing all the time, when people are in trouble and you need that big healing, mastery comes in big and can give you those really huge healing surges or chain harvests or whatever you're using. And also crit is, while it's not as good for damage as verse, because lava burst always crits, it's still a great stat for healing, and it also helps your mana with resurgence, I think the passive is called. So understand that if you're just gearing up and you're moving up the ladder, I'd probably recommend a good mix of all the stats and just sort of use your gems and enchants for stuff that you feel like you're low of, either haste or mastery usually. However, if you're really trying to push damage, and you'll see some of the top shamans doing this, pure crit and verse. And to follow into trinkets, I'm also following that same guidelines. So you'll see me using Glyph of Assimilation. This is strictly for damage. I'm never trying to, or almost never trying to proc this for the mastery bonus. I'm only using it as a pure single target burst because it has high intellect and it also does high damage. This is a high single target burst damage trinket. It's good for priority targets. It's good for bosses with the pride buff. It's good for helping kill prides. And with that, following the last boss trinket, Dreadfire, sorry, I was blanking on what it's called. Dreadfire Vessel is also really good. So if you're not mythic rating, if you can't get a hold of a mythic one of these, a heroic Dreadfire is a good substitute for damage. And then secondarily, besides DPS trinkets, I want just a bunch of stats. So any trinket that gives you a bunch of stats consistently is a good trinket for Shaman. So think of Kabbalist Hymnal is a good example. For Mythic Plus trinkets, we can talk about the Changeling. If you have one of these that you can level up, unfortunately I didn't get this after the patch, so I can't level this one up with Leech. The Insignia of Alacrity, this is another good trinket that gives you stats. It also can help you out. If you feel like you have really low haste and you want to get your haste up, you can go into PvP and just get one of these and level it up real quick. IQD is okay. Personally, I don't like unused trinkets that give you stats. I would prefer the procs just because they have higher uptime. However, especially if you're running Manatide Legendary, which we'll talk about legendaries later, having an unused stat trinket paired with something like that is good. I find that it's not that useful to pair something like IQD with Ascendance, because Ascendance is already so powerful that I'm not looking to double down. Very rarely do I press Ascendance and I feel like I need more healing. I'm mainly looking for more consistent stats that'll either help my damage or shore up some of the times when I don't have Ascendance. Otherwise, just use whatever. If you can't get a hold of a good stat trinket, just use whatever you have at high item level. I was even using something as silly as like the Satchel from Necrotic Wake, I believe. As you'll see, I actually open all my stuff in DPS spec just to get these DPS trinkets, because there's not very many good healer trinkets that you want. So I actually always am in elemental spec to try and loot DPS trinkets. So for legendary, it's actually pretty interesting. A lot of people are asking about legendary choices, and the thing that you have to understand with Shaman is that all the legendaries are okay. None of them are really that strong where it's like, oh man, once you get this legendary, it feels great. All of them are sort of situational. So you have two options for a legendary. Number one, for your first craft, I would probably use something that will help you in a lot of situations, especially if you're trying to gear up through either PvP or raid. So if you're trying to raid, Primal Tidecore is really strong, and it's okay in Mythic Plus, and it's BIS and raid. So this is a great first legendary to craft if you ever feel like you're going to be raiding. And then likewise, Earthen Harmony, the Earthshield one, is really good for PvP. So if you're going to end up gearing up in PvP, you have a couple of friends to play with. This one, while it's not the best in Mythic Plus, it's still good in some situations, especially if you're gearing up with tanks that maybe are taking a little bit too much damage. It's good for tank healing and it's great for PvP. So try and find a legendary that that you'll use in a bunch of different things. But a lot of people tell me, Growl, I don't care. I only play Mythic Plus. I'm only ever going to play Mythic Plus. What do I make? And it's like, well, even then, there's still sort of situational uses. So what I made first for Mythic Plus is Spirit Walker's Tidal Totem. This acts as another cooldown. A lot of people think about this as Manatide Totem. Think about it as it turns your Manatide Totem into something else. It turns your Manatide Totem into a button that you can press when you need to do a lot of healing. It's like a mini Ascendance, if you will. So what I do is I'll use the Manatide Totem, I'll press with the legendary, and then as soon as I'll just spam out chain heals or healing waves if I need single target healing, and it just increases your HPS over 10 seconds. Think of it as like a mini Ascendance, right? And that's what I use it for. So if you find yourself, oh, I don't feel like Mana Tide is that good or whatever, it's completely different. What the legendary does is acts as another little cooldown. Let's say you either want something that's a little bit more lower maintenance, or you feel like you don't really need the extra cooldown. Well, then your options are Jonats, which was buffed recently. I haven't got a chance to try this, but I'd assume it's pretty good. Chain Heal generally isn't a button that you want to press too much. However, with the Jonats buff, if it's buffed by 100%, it can be pretty strong. Also, keep in mind that if you're using the Necrolord Covenant ability, all of your healing waves go into this. So let's say you use a healing wave with that duplicates 5 times on your whole party because you have a bunch of Riptides out. It'll actually immediately give you 5 stacks of Jonats to be able to use. So specifically with Necrolord, Jonats is good, but I still think it's probably usable if you don't like Primal Tide. Primal Tide, again, is a nice... Primal Tide and Earthen Harmony, as I said about Raid and PvP, are still fine, like set and forget legendaries that you don't even have to think about them. And if you just want something that's easy, but, you know, that's not really the purpose of this guide, is to give you something easy. So that's why I'm talking about all these. Now let's talk about damage. So the 2 damage ones that I've tried are Deep Tremor and Chains. The problem with Chains, even though Chain Lightning is really good, Chain Heal just feels so bad to cast, and when you run this, you're tempted to double down on your Chain Healing by running like Conduits or other stuff that makes it stronger, but Chain Heal just doesn't do that much healing, especially if you need single target healing. This one is still okay, especially in dungeons or situations where you feel like you can't keep your Earth Ellie alive. Maybe in Pugs you may find this easier than Earth Ellie, but for a DPS legendary, I prefer the Earth Ellie Earthquake Lego. And this is, while it's not insane DPS or anything, it's okay, right? It gives you a nice little damage boost. It usually ends up being about 15% or so of my damage if I can get good uses out of the Earth Ellie. People often ask me, how do I keep the Earth Ellie alive? Do you heal it? As you go up into higher keys, you eventually just can't heal it, or maybe you can heal it for a few seconds. You want to try and time it in situations where the Earth Ellie just won't die or will take little damage. So the most obvious one is against bosses. So for example, Theater of Pain, there's lots of great bosses that you can use it against. The first boss is a 3-boss council where you're hitting 3 targets for a full minute with the Earth Ellie. Also with Zav, you're hitting the banner and you're doing damage to both. So there's lots of good damage that you get out of the Earth Ellie. There's also 5 bosses, so you can use it on all 5. Other than that, you can use it on caster packs. Let's say mobs that don't hit very hard or are usually casting or at range. Using the Earth Ellie on those is really good. And again, sometimes you're going to use the Earth Ellie, it's going to die instantly. You're not going to get a lot of value out of it. But unfortunately, there just aren't a lot. Like, none of the legendaries that you use are going to feel amazing where it's doing tons of stuff, right? The other side benefit that's a little bit silly to the Earth Ellie Lego is it actually makes solo content so good. So let's say you don't feel like learning Ellie and you just want to do your world quests and your Torghast and stuff as resto. Using Deep Tremor makes world quests and stuff so much easier because you can just pull Enormous. You can pull Enormous and Torghast. You don't have to worry about getting the power. If you get the power, you actually get 2 of them. So that's my thoughts on the Legos. Basically, any of the other Legos I think are probably not worth using. You know, the deeply rooted and the Sefus I tried. None of these I really tried or think that are good. Maybe they may get buffed in the future, but so that's my general thoughts on legendaries. So now I'm going to talk about covenants. This is one that's really, really popular because all the Shaman covenants got changed a lot. So first, I think if you're raiding, Necrolord is a great choice because Necrolord is, again, a really good all-around covenant. It's good for raid, it's good for PvP, it's good for Mythic Plus. It's generally, I would say, a safer covenant choice for healing. It probably does the least damage out of all 4 covenants, but it does the most healing. It's also very convenient. It's a 45-second cooldown, so you don't have to worry as much about, oh, I need to hold my Necrolord ability, or it's some, you can just keep throwing it out every time. You can even throw it out as just for flame shocks at the beginning of a pull, and even if you get in trouble later, you'll still have it up. You can still hold that charge for the heal, and then by the time the charge runs out, you'll have only 30 seconds till the next one comes out. So as a good safety, or if you're raiding, I think Necrolord is a good choice. For Mythic Plus, the one I've been playing is Venthyr. Venthyr has 2 main benefits to it. Number 1, it's really good for damage. Even if you're using it for healing, it's always hitting a bunch of targets. You don't have to decide whether you use it for healing and damage. The other benefit is that there's a very big shortage of Venthyr players in Mythic Plus. There's not a lot of popular meta classes that play Venthyr. So you have an easier time getting into groups. Also, if you have a static group that you're playing with every day, you know, chances are you have a mage and a boomkin because they're really OP right now. Neither one of those classes play Venthyr. Tanks don't really play Venthyr. So having Venthyr allows more flexibility with the groups that you play in, both in pugs and with a static group. So those are the main benefits of Venthyr. Personally, I switched to Venthyr just because my group needed it, but the ability kind of grew on me. It's a little annoying because the cast is kind of long, and it's also a longer CD than Healing Wave. It's tempting to try and stack a bunch of crit to try and reduce the CD of it often, but it's, you know, generally still random, so you don't really want to do that for consistent damage. You just want haste and verse. It usually ends up being about 10% of my damage or so, and that's like, you know, doing a decent amount, you know, 2.5 3k or something. This seems like a reasonable breakdown here. Maybe I was doing some world quests or something with this, but so then I'll talk about Kyrian. So Kyrian is actually kind of slept on. I almost know shamans play Kyrian, mainly because there's just no need for Kyrian, but the Kyrian ability is actually really, really good. Vesper Totem is, or sorry, let me rephrase. The Kyrian ability is very mediocre. It's not as good as the other abilities, but the Kyrian passives are very, very good. So you have File, which lets you remove diseases and bleeds from yourself. One of the problems with shamans is that you can only remove curses. You can't remove anything else from yourself, I mean, besides magic. And the Kyrian File lets you get rid of diseases, poisons, bleeds, and stuff that shaman struggles with, which makes it really, really nice. It also lets you just dispel yourself and self-heal in an emergency if you don't have a button to heal yourself quick. The other benefit of Vesper Totem is that of the Pelagos Soulbind, it gives you a huge mastery buff every time you press Vesper Totem. The reason that's good is because if you're set up like this, where you're having pure haste verse, although Vesper Totem itself isn't doing much healing, you can use that buff, that on-demand mastery buff, to give you a bunch of healing in a pinch. So you can actually sort of use it. It's not really a quick emergency, but like, let's say, oh no, a bunch of damage is coming in, or this is a really hard pride, something like that. You can press Vesper Totem, you get that big mastery buff, and then that kicks in on your healing. And because your mastery is so low, you're getting such a huge benefit from that mastery if you're running a pure haste verse build. So even though Kyrian is like a nice middle ground between healing and damage, I would say, the downside is that it seems like everybody plays Kyrian, or at least every tank does, so there's not really a big need to play Kyrian. And the last one, the one that I haven't really got to try at all since the buff, was Night Fae. Honestly, the Night Fae ability looks really fun and really good. If I was someone who only pugged, or I was just messing around, or for whatever reason I decided I could play Night Fae, I would definitely try it, because it seems like the best of both worlds in that it gives you the good damage that Chain Harvest gives, but it doesn't have the drawback of having to heal and do damage at the same time. You can do the damage first, then you can save the healing for later. A lot of times the problems that you have with Chain Harvest is that let's say you start a pull, there's a bunch of targets, you want to chain heal, or you want to chain harvest because it just does a lot of damage and it's ready. However, you don't get any healing benefit from it because the pull just started. And the Night Fae ability gives you that decouple where you can use it and it sort of stores that healing, kind of like a Cloudburst, and you can use it later. So although I haven't got to try it because, you know, everyone in my group plays Night Fae, so won't really fit. If you're just sort of slumming it in pugs, or you just want to try stuff, Night Fae seems really, really fun. And I'll talk about Soulbinds briefly. I'm only really going to talk about Venthyr because I haven't... Well, so Necrolord, I was playing Emini, but I think you can also play Plague Divisor for the immunity Fleshcraft shield in some situations. I didn't get a lot of chance to test it, but I think you would swap between those depending on if you can get value. A lot of people ask about Soulbinds. Personally, guys, just don't worry about Soulbinds that much. I feel like people obsess over these, but they're so close together. Like, basically, Hold Your Ground is 2% healing and 10% stamina. Thrill Seeker is on average 2% haste, and then Theatar gives you a mastery buff and gives you a little bit of healing. So like you can sort of switch between. Generally Theatar is better for just pure healing, but Draven is really good for prides because you're standing still the whole time or most of the time, and you're always getting this full stamina and healing benefit during prides. But honestly, experiment with these, try them out. The only thing I'll say, be careful with Service and Stone. It shatters and it puts you in combat. So if you instantly release after you die, this will keep you in combat. So be careful with this. Well, but I do want to talk about the conduits a little bit. So the number one by far still is Swirling Currents. Swirling Currents is really, really good. No matter what your tree is, you should be playing Swirling Currents. Secondarily, you can sort of decide what you want to use for your second potency. So Heavy Rainfall is the go-to for Pride. If you feel like you're struggling with Pride healing, or you just, you either don't want to use cooldowns or you don't have cooldowns, or maybe it's Grievous Week, you'll usually see me running Heavy Rainfall just for the extra healing with Pride. Again, if you math this out, it isn't that good. However, it's something, right? It's something, it's consistent. It'll happen every single Pride. If you have Healing Tide, you'll get this extra, 8,000 or something healing that you get from Heavy Rainfall. Alternatively, if you're looking to do a bit more damage, you can run whatever the potency is for your specific covenant. I think that usually ends up being the best choice otherwise. So for Venthyr, Lavish Harvest, the 25% reset one for Necrolord. I don't even know what the other ones do, but they all basically just increase the damage a little bit. If you feel like you don't need Heavy Rainfall, you can run that. Another alternative is to run Embrace of Earth, especially if you feel like you need more tank healing. This is one that you're sort of going to have to feel out. If you're playing with a really good tank, you're probably not going to have too much use for this. But let's say you're in a pug and you think, oh, this guy might need a little bit of extra healing, or maybe he's under geared, or maybe you just, for whatever reason you feel like the tank needs healing. This is one that you would want to run. I think Nature's Reach is a trap. I wouldn't run this just because Chain Heal isn't a button that you want to press very often anyway. Okay, so let's talk about talents. For the most part, the talents in my guide that I put out stand up. There's not really anything I would change, but I will address some common questions in here. The first row, you use so much Healing Surge and Healing Wave and Mythic Plus that you get so much value from Undulation. A lot of people ask about Torrent or Unleash Life. Look, if you're not spamming Healing Surge or Healing Wave, you can run these for like easier keys or whatever. But ultimately, if you're not spamming Healing Surge and Healing Wave, you're not really doing that much healing anyway, right? That's the bulk of your healing if you're using those abilities. Oh, I don't have a good breakdown here, but the bulk of your healing is going to be coming from Healing Surge and Healing Wave, and you want that Undulation. Especially if you're running, well, I guess Unleash will work with the Necrolord ability too, but keep in mind Unleash works with Chain Harvest and the Necrolord ability. Undulation works with the Necrolord ability as well. Undulation is just good. This row right here, just totally preference. This one matters very little. Spirit usually as a default, I'll run Spirit Wolf, mainly because of the extra DR. You only really have Astral Shift, and sometimes there are emergencies where you are gonna die and you don't have Astral Shift, and you don't have the chance. Like let's say you're moving, or like you have a mob hitting you and you need to run away. It just gives you a little bit of extra DR in Ghost Wolf, so that's my default choice. During Spiteful, or if the tank feels like they need to kite a lot, I'll use Earth Grab. And Static Charge is like okay if you feel like you need to stun stuff a lot. But generally in an organized group, I try not to just throw out random cap totems all the time, because you're going to DR mobs when, like for instance, the Rogue is going to want to put big stuns on important mobs. And if you're just throwing out cap totem at the beginning of every pull, you're going to DR the Rogue's big stun on the important mobs with just like a short 3-second stun from yours, which is not something you want to do. For this row, this is a row that probably gets asked the most. Think of it like this. Earthen Wall gives you HPS. AV extends people's health bars. So if you feel like you need the stacked HPS, you can run Earthen Wall. But otherwise, generally with Shaman, what Shaman's strength is HPS. You can do a lot of stacked healing already. So for instance, on a Grievous week, or let's say you're healing a really high Pride that you might be a little bit scared of, you can run Earthen Wall if you feel like you need the healing. Maybe in like Sanguine Depths or Theater where there's just a lot of healing and it's really tough. but in general, AV is going to be really, really good. Think of it like extending 10% health on your tank permanently through the whole dungeon. Like, tanks love Ancestral. If you think that tanks like Earthen Wall does almost nothing for tanks, right? Reducing 600 damage, but giving the tank 10% extra HP for almost the entire dungeon and any scary pulls is great. Remember that it works with Riptide too. So let's say in an emergency, you maybe don't have the time to cast Healing Surge or use any abilities, but with AV, just putting a Riptide on a target not only gives you that initial heal and the hot, but it also extends their health by 10% for that 10 seconds. So in a either boss that hits really hard, for example, like the second boss of Sanguine Depths, it's gonna put Castigate on someone, it's gonna hit really hard. It gives them that extra 10% life so that they have a chance to live. Even if it doesn't do any healing, that 10% health is gonna save people from mechanics. Same with Proctor. If you're using Riptide on the whole party and, like, let's say you need to move around, you're dodging the swirlies, just putting Riptide on somebody who's dipping low is gonna give them that extra health and also, you know, the Riptide heal and stuff. Other than that, I think none of the other talents are really that negotiable. You should always run Cloudburst. You should always run Ascendance. This row, I don't think matters too much. Generally, I prefer Graceful Spirit, but again, if you feel like you need extra healing, you can run Nature's Guardian just to help protect yourself a little bit. There's probably some utility and something to be said for Windrush too, but it's just not something that's it's hard to get value from. But like, for instance, in theater, maybe if you throw down a Windrush while your team's running through the middle, it probably does save you a decent amount of time if you can, you know. So I would say this row, the 40 row and the 25 row are mostly preference. And lastly, I want to talk about healing high prides. So in my video, I talked a little bit about prides in my initial guide, but you'll get to the point, especially if you're trying to push damage and you're not like you don't really have that great of a setup for healing, you will maybe struggle with prides a little bit as you get into really high keys or maybe during a hard week like Grievous. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my pride rotation. So the first important thing about pride, this is true for every healer, is that the way that you go into the pride is super, super important. So if you go into the pride where everyone is full health and you have full mana, or you have, you know, anything above, let's say 40% mana is basically infinite mana for pride, and you have cooldowns, it's so much easier than if you go into a pride and you have a Spiteful chasing you and your team is dipping low and you don't have Ascendance, right? Like, the way that you go into a pride is really important. So in a situation where, let's say you have 17% count, 18% count, and you know a pride is going to be coming, it can be tempting to be trying to either push damage or do other stuff, but you have to come to this realization that, okay, I have to clean up this pull. Let me start getting my Riptides out. Let me start saving my Cloudburst charges. That's really big. Maybe I'll throw down a Healing Rain beforehand just to have something on the ground because I have a lot of mana and time right now. Set up for the pride so that the beginning is easy. Because if the beginning is easy, number one, you're keeping everyone topped as long as possible. Number two, you can do a little bit of DPS. So as soon as the pride spawns, I'm throwing out Flame Shock and I'm using Lava Burst maybe once, and then I'm trying my best to keep Flame Shock on the pride and also use my Lava Burst procs when I can. It's not super important because, you know, your team's doing a lot more damage than you, and you don't want to let people dip low for these buttons, but these are pretty efficient buttons, and if you don't necessarily need them, then you should throw them out. So at the beginning of the pride, I'm doing a little bit of damage. I'm also using Healing Rain. In Pugs, if you feel like people aren't standing in your Healing Rain, just don't press it. You need 4 people to make good value of Healing Rain, and if, you know, you have a Hunter that's over here and a Mage that's over here and a Boomkin that's over here, and it just feels like it's you and the tank sitting in the Healing Rain, just don't bother pressing it. Don't get angry, oh, my team won't stand in Healing Rain. Just don't press it. You know, you have to adapt to the situation that you're in. But in ideal world, press Healing Rain. Okay, so now as the pride's building up, you want to put down your Healing Tide, and if you're running Heavy Rainfall, that's going to be even better. Don't rely on Healing Tide as some big cooldown. It's like, think of it as like a mini cooldown that you're just using towards the first third to half of the pride. You're throwing down Healing Tide to boost your Healing Rain if you're running Heavy Rainfall, just to keep everybody topped. Your big cooldowns for pride are either Ascendance, Mana Tide if you have it, and your Covenant ability. I haven't got too much chance to test the Night Fae or Kyrian ability, but with both Necrolord and Venthyr Covenant abilities, it's really, really strong. You can basically just press the button, make sure that you have a Cloudburst rolling when you press that button, because both the Necrolord ability and the Venthyr ability do so much healing, and it's also going to juice your Cloudburst, so you always want to have a Cloudburst down when you're using any big cooldown like that. So usually around 12 to 15 stacks of Pride, and when I start, anywhere from my start to my end of my second Cloudburst is when I like to use my Covenant ability. Then if that ends up not being enough, which when you get into 23, 24 Prides, it's going to be enough, that's when you want to have either Ascendance or Mana Tide if you have the Mana Tide Lego. If you don't have the Mana Tide Lego, usually I just throw down Mana Tide at the beginning if I'm ever worried about my mana. And then I'll have Ascendance for the Pride. Especially if you don't have Mana Tide Lego, you need to save Ascendance for the Pride every single time, because you basically don't have any other big cooldowns. And unless your team is blowing Combustion and Convoke, or Combustion and AR, or just any big cooldowns on the Pride, you're gonna need a big healing cooldown. Try to hold it as long as you can, but don't be too greedy. The good thing about Ascendance is it does a lot of healing on the button press. So again, just like your Covenant ability, make sure you have the Cloudburst on the ground before you press Ascendance, because that puts a ton of healing into the Cloudburst for free, along with the healing that it's doing. And it lasts 15 seconds. Generally, a Pride is going to last you about, let's say a hard Pride is going to be 50 to 55 seconds or so, under a minute. If a Pride is lasting over a minute, your team is kind of trolling, but from 50 to 55 seconds, right? So that means Ascendance, you want to press generally about 35 seconds into the Pride or so. So usually that's just about getting to 20 stacks or close to that. And during Ascendance, you just want to spam Healing Surge. Healing Surge is really good on yourself if you're running the Endurance Conduit for Healing Surge on yourself, because it does more healing. Especially if you're sitting in a link, you can Healing Surge yourself, because it doesn't matter who you're Healing Surging when you're in a link, so you want to use it on yourself. Other than that, once your Ascendance is down, you're just spamming Healing Surge. Ideally, you're keeping up your healing rain as long as you can. One thing I like to do is use my healing rain when my Cloudburst is about to expire. As a beginner, it's kind of hard to play around Cloudburst, but let's say here I am, right? My Cloudburst is about to expire. I know it's going to push everyone's health up, so I'll use this time right here to press Healing Rain, because even though I'm spending a lot of time, boom, that Cloudburst goes off, it heals everyone. Then I can press my new Cloudburst, and I'm sort of setting myself up for the next 15 or 20 seconds. Shaman's healing, although you don't really ramp, you kind of do, right? You kind of want to have that setup. You want to have Riptides out, you want to have Earth Shield, you want to have Healing Rain down. So the more you can think for the future, the easier those Prides get. And then in an emergency, I'll use Spirit Link. Sometimes I'll use Spirit Link if I don't want to use my Ascendance. Let's say my team is blasting the Pride and I'm a little worried about it. I'll just throw down the Spirit Link. Remember that the Spirit Link does have DR as well. And especially if your team is immuning, for example, if you have a mage that ice blocks or rogue that cloaks, your Spirit Link is even more effective because it's sharing their health. Another use of Spirit Link is if your team gets hit by the boss. Let's say it's very high stacks and your team is panicking, and then someone gets hit by an orb. They go from full health to almost zero health immediately. You can throw down that link in an instant. That's part of the reason why I don't like using it earlier, because it's a good emergency button if someone gets hit, especially if you're tank. I feel like the tank is the hardest part to deal with the boast, and saving Spirit Link for an emergency is great. Spirit Link is really, really good against Prides. You know, if you're dying to Prides, you don't want to hold on to it, but it's good in emergency. Ideally, though, you don't want to use it when your whole party is at 10%. If your whole party is at 10% and you press Spirit Link, you know, they're just going to die anyway, right? You want to give that 10% DR, and you want to be sharing the people who are... Again, it's important to communicate too. Let's say you're going into a Pride and it's really hard, right? If you have 20% mana, 25% mana, you don't have big cooldowns, you're going into a Pride, communicate that to your team. Ideally, if you're doing high keys, you're in Discord or something, be like, yo, hard Pride, you know, let them know that this is going to be tough, because if they're on the fence, like, it could be really hard for a DPS player to know. Let's say the Pride is at 20 stacks and they don't know how much healing you have, right? They don't know, like, likewise, if I have a ton of healing, right? Let's say I have a 70k cloudburst and I still have my ascendance up, I'll let my team know, you know, don't big cloudburst coming, you know, because that way, number one, they don't waste their health potions or immunes or anything like that. And number two, like a mage can time their altar time, or they can, you know, save defensives, or they know that they don't have to panic combust or whatever, because you lose a lot of time if your team is wasting stuff on the pride when they don't need it. So try and communicate to your team as well. If you're going into a pride, you have everything, right? You have good mana, you have cloudburst, you have ascendance, you know, just communicate to your team. I have big cooldowns here. When a cloudburst is going to go off, that's going to top everyone, you know. Like the worst thing that can happen is if your team, if let's say everyone's sitting at like, you know, half to low health, right? And you're casting a healing rain because you know that cloudburst is so juicy and it's going to top everybody. But as soon, you know, your team gets worried because they're at 20% health and they press healing potion or health stone, or they use their Kyrian file, and then, you know, your cloudburst just gets wasted. And so communication is very, very important for prides. I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. Again, I apologize a little bit that it wasn't as heavily edited and tons of graphics on stream, but I wanted to get some content out there for people so that they can get my opinions on what I think and how I've been doing in 905. I guess I'll share a little bit on what I think about Shaman now in the state of everything. We're starting to see a shift where everyone's playing Paladin in Mythic Plus because of that damage meta, because Paladin's doing so much damage. Honestly, Shaman can do really, really good damage. And I think there was like a little bit of a worry from Shamans that they were just going to fall off. But the Chain Lightning buff, the Earthquake LE and the Earthquake LE buff, the re-gearing towards DPS, like, yeah, you can't compete with Ashen Hollow, but you can still do respectable damage. You know, you can get to the point where the Paladin's only 1.5k DPS ahead of you or something. It's not like he's doing triple your damage. So if you're feeling insecure and you know, you can gear up for DPS. One good thing that you can do is have lots of different gear, right? A lot of people ask what the best items are, but healing is situational. It's about getting through the situations that you know you're going to struggle with. So just because I use DPS trinkets or like, you know, high haste rings, there are some times when I think, you know what, if we just live this key, we're going to time it, right? We don't need the damage. So in that case, you know, I'll swap off the Earth LE. I might run Mana Tide Lego instead. Maybe I'll switch out a ring. I'll drop some of my haste to higher crit verse for more mana efficiency. Maybe I'll switch out a trinket. Maybe I'll run Changeling instead of Glyph. I probably wouldn't do that just because it's a big item level loss. But you get my point, right? Try and think more about what I'm going to need in this key and less about, oh, what's the best. And again, that's sort of why I didn't talk about this a lot in my original guide, because, you know, if you're just gearing up your Shaman, you don't know what the hell you need, right? You're just listening to the cat with a waffle on his head. But once you get some experience, start to really actively think about what does your team need? How much healing do I need? How much damage do I need? And don't just necessarily copy people because they do it, or, you know, oh, you like this guy or you think this guy's the best, you know. I want to give you guys the tools to decide rather than just, you know, be the gatekeeper and you guys have to come to me to oh, okay, this is the best Lego, this is the best trinket, you know, all that stuff. So anyway, I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. I think I'm going to do one for Disc Priest and maybe even Holy Priest or Holy Paladin as well if I get a bit more experience in there. If you have any more advice or feedback on the video, feel free to leave a comment. And thank you so much for watching again, and happy keying.